designed to host, to do amongst other things, host a series of conversations about matters related to ethics that are sort of interest to the general public. And this evening is a continuation of that theme. So if you should find yourself interested in the conversation tonight, which I'm sure you will, please feel free to reach out to myself or anyone else in the philosophy department to have a conversation about how you might engage with some of these more questions in some classroom settings as a major or minor, or just taking a class. Okay. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Professor Alexandra Plakias. She is an assistant professor of philosophy at Hamilton College. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She's published in journals such as Ethical Theory and Moral Practice and Sympathies. And really, really recently, this is awesome, in addition to working on subjects in meta-ethics and moral psychology, she does work on food and philosophy. She published her new book, Thinking About Food, A Philosophical Introduction, that was just released. But join me in welcoming her.
Okay, thank you so much for coming, and it's cool that she used the microphone. Thanks for coming, and thank you to Professor Riddle for inviting me. So speaking of food, one way to think about the topic of tonight's talk is as answering the question, how do we get from this, the emotion that governs, what we eat, how we react to bodily fluids, things like that, to this, an emotion that governs our reaction to violations of social and moral and even political norms. And that's the question that I'm going to answer in the first part of tonight's talk. So in this case, we have an example of the language of disgust being invoked to condemn racism. Here we see it used to express the writer's disapproval of abortion. The editorial ranks very high on the disgust meter, this letter writer says. The recent terrorist attack in New Zealand, this Minister of Parliament finds the rhetoric that was used disgusting. Here we have the Foreign Minister of the United Kingdom using the language of disgust to condemn some actions in Venezuela. So disgust is certainly not just a kind of child's emotion that we use when we're talking about toilet humor or something like that. We see it at the highest levels of political discourse here. Another example here, and of course I would be remiss if I did not mention the recent college cheating scandal. Cheating and unfairness is another place we see the rhetoric of disgust used quite a lot. Okay, so the question is, what do these things, right? Eating a worm, seeing a bug crawl out of your food, racism, cheating, foreign aid, what do these things have to do with one another? How does the same emotion end up governing both of these domains of discourse? So the plan for tonight's talk, first I'll give an overview of disgust. I'll talk about some general features of what I take to be a really fascinating and, I don't know if I want to say underappreciated, but perhaps often overlooked emotion. I know that many people will probably be eating dinner after this, so I promise to keep the examples at a fairly high level of generality. I would say the worm picture is about as gross as it's going to get. Then I'll talk about how disgust operates in these moral, social, and political contexts. And I'll look at some interesting work in psychology showing disgust's effect on moral judgment, describe some experiments, and I will then go on to look at the way that some philosophers have taken up this issue. Because you might think, look, there's something importantly different. It's one thing to condemn your opponent as immoral or unfair or corrupt. But to call someone disgusting, that's different. You might think that's a different order of condemnation. You might think the language of disgust really doesn't have a place in civilized moral discourse. And this is something a lot of philosophers have argued, right? We should try to remove this language of disgust because there's just something a little too personal with calling someone disgusting. It doesn't really belong in our moral domain. So I'll look at some of these critiques and explain why people have thought that disgust is ill-suited to play a role in our moral discourse. I think these critiques are interesting. I also think they're all wrong. So what I'm going to do at the end of the talk is offer you my alternative diagnosis, and obviously the far superior diagnosis of what is wrong with moral disgust. Okay, so let's start by talking about the emotion of disgust. If you look at this facial expression, this is the classic disgust face, right? Ugh. You pull back the lips, you wrinkle your nose, you move yourself back from whatever the disgusting thing is. Disgust is related to a more basic response, namely distaste. So, imagine eating something really bitter, right? That's the distaste response. You want it out of your mouth. Ugh, it's not good, right? Notice, though, disgust is different from distaste in important ways, right? So, the disgust face, you can see evidence of it in little babies, right? If you give a baby something that they don't like or maybe have never tried before, they'll be like, yeah, right? They stick their tongue out. You get this in rats, too, and monkeys, right? You can go on YouTube and find videos of them getting, bitter substances, and they all make the same face. So that's the distaste response, right? It tells you to get this thing out of your mouth. It doesn't taste good. Disgust is different, though. First, disgust starts before the thing is even in your mouth, right? If you dislike broccoli, you'll leave it on your dinner plate, you might just not eat it. If you're disgusted by broccoli, you don't want it on your plate. You might not even want it on anyone else's plate, right? You might not even want to think about it. You don't need to eat it to be disgusted by it, right? So disgust is a much more intense emotion and response than distaste. When you feel disgust, in addition to making the classic facial expression and pulling yourself back from the thing, you might find, you've got some increased salivation, you might feel nauseous, you might even find yourself gagging a little bit. And again, this might happen certainly without tasting or ingesting or touching the thing. It might just be the sight of something, a description of something, maybe even just thinking about something is enough to kind of get you feeling a little queasy, right? One thing that's interesting is if you think about the verbal expressions we use for disgust, ick, yuck, right? These are fairly constant across all languages. And I should say, disgust is a cross-culturally universal emotion. Every culture has disgust. I used to say when I would give this part of the talk that only humans experience disgust, but there's a new book by the primatologist Franz de Waal that just came out about animal emotion, and he has some interesting evidence that primates feel disgust. So I no longer will say only humans feel it. Notice what all of these linguistic expressions have in common. Ich, yuck, pwah. They're all kind of plosive. They get the thing out of your mouth, right? They expel it from your mouth. So this will be, I'll come back to this in a minute when we talk about what the function of disgust is. Disgust also, unlike distaste, comes up in development fairly late. If you've ever spent a lot of time around very young toddlers or babies and poop, you know that babies don't have disgust. They're not disgusted by stuff. They'll touch anything. They don't care. And part of the reason that young children don't have disgust is because in addition to these behavioral and affective responses, there's a kind of cognition that comes along with disgust. Namely, disgust makes you think of the thing, the elicitor, as offensive somehow, right? It's revolting. There's this second aspect of disgust, which is sometimes referred to as contamination potency. And this is the idea that if something is disgusting, it can transmit that disgustingness to something else. So if I am disgusted by cockroaches, and I am, and that cockroach touches a cookie, that cookie just became disgusting too. And what's more, that cookie can even make something else disgusting, right? In fact, one way you can measure how disgust-sensitive people are is with cookies, right? Okay, how disgusting, is this disgusting to you? Yeah? Okay, I'm gonna put it on a cookie. Now I'm gonna touch a second cookie to that first cookie. How many cookies is it gonna take before you'll eat the cookie, right? And if you're really disgusted by that thing, it might take a few. So the idea here is that disgust, a disgusting object contaminates anything it comes into contact with. And this is important later when we think about the role that disgust plays in our social lives and in our moral lives. Okay, so what is disgusting? What kinds of things are disgusting? And again, I promise to keep it fairly general here. Bodily fluids and excretions, virtually all of them, with one exception. There's one bodily fluid that is not typically thought of as disgusting. Does anyone want to guess? Saliva? Maybe sometimes in some contexts.
Tears?
Tears, excellent, yes, tears. And this is interesting. Keep this in mind because when we talk about the role and the meaning of disgust, right, one thing about tears is they're human, right? Tears are part of what makes us human. And as we'll see in a minute, part of what people have thought about disgust is there's something about disgust that is an attempt to make us feel less animal, right? It distances us from the animal. So this point about tears is an interesting one, right? I'll go fairly quickly over the rest, but suffice to say any kind of mutilated bodies or exposed organs, things like this, things that are slimy, rotting, organic material. You know, this is not universal, but insects and snakes tend to be elicitors of disgust. Things that slither and crawl. And you can see this in the Bible, right? Whatsoever goeth upon the belly and goeth upon all four, or hath more feet among all creeping things that creep, them ye shall not eat, for they are an abomination. Right? And actually, this is an interesting one, right? In much of Western culture, we think it's disgusting to eat insects, but of course in many other cultures, they're considered a delicacy. As Chris mentioned, I work on food, so we can talk about insects during the Q&A if you want. It's actually not just acceptable to eat insects. It would be awesome if we all started eating insects, right? They're not just a healthy food, they're a very environmentally friendly food. So here we can see how disgust could be an impediment to adopting a really helpful practice. And we can also see this massive amount of cross-cultural variation in attitudes towards insects. Certain kinds of sexual practices, I have incest and bestiality here, necrophilia would be another one. Cannibalism, maybe, again, not cross-culturally universal. So, you know, as these examples show, there's a lot of cross-cultural variation, and context matters quite a lot too, right? Someone mentioned saliva is not disgusting, you know, and it's not in a lot of contexts. You might even find yourself quite excited about the prospect of ingesting someone's saliva, right, in the right context. But if you put it on top of a muffin, you probably will be less pleased about the thought of, you know, getting it into your mouth. Okay. So those are the disgust elicitors. And what a lot of these things have in common is that they point us to a problem that our evolutionary ancestors would have faced. Namely, the world is full of invisible killers, right? Germs, parasites, poisons, pathogens. You can't see them, but they're potentially everywhere, right? And yet we have to eat something, we have to move around in the world. So how do we avoid these things? And one story about disgust is, this is evolution's way of helping us avoid this potential killer that's all around us, right? We learn to be disgusted by, or we evolved the tendency to be disgusted by, things that typically are associated with parasites, pathogens, and poisons. We also learn not to touch anything that has touched those things, right? So even before people have a theory of germs, right, because that doesn't happen until relatively late in human development, people have a theory of, if you just touch that rotting, slimy thing, I don't want to touch you, right? If my cookie fell on that rotten, slimy body, I don't want to eat the cookie anymore. So disgust is kind of this, this solution to this big evolutionary problem of how to avoid basically killing ourselves by ingesting the wrong thing, by touching the wrong thing, etc. Now, if that's true, then we should expect disgust to give us a lot of false positives, right? It's going to be an overly cautious response. Better to be safe than sorry. Maybe this cockroach doesn't have disease-causing germs on it, but all it takes is one, right? And this also explains the contamination potency aspect of disgust. right? It's going to make us not want to come into contact with anything that has come into contact with a disgusting thing. But as the quotes at the beginning of the talk show, if this is what disgust evolved to do, its function now goes well beyond that, right? It's definitely extended itself into other domains of our life, namely the moral, the social, and the political. And the question is, should it? Should we allow it into those aspects of our discourse, our judgment, and our practice? So, there's three questions we can ask about moral disgust here. The first is, when and how does disgust play a role in moral judgment? And I'll describe some psychological studies on this in a minute. The second question, which I will say less about, is where does moral disgust play this role? Is it all of our moral judgments, or is it just a subset of moral judgments? Now, okay, I guess I will say something about this. For a long time, the orthodoxy was disgust is really only involved in judgments about sex, food, and maybe kind of religious purity or something like that. But I think that's just obviously false. And I think that the pictures I put up here at the beginning of the talk show that that's false. The other orthodoxy for a long time was like, oh, conservatives use disgust in their moral discourse, but liberals don't. Again, I think this is just patently false, and I think it's becoming obviously false. I'm giving a talk on this next week. I'll be on a panel with someone who has been just, using Google basically to analyze occurrences of disgust, and he's found that liberals actually use disgust as much or more in their political discourse than conservatives do. It may be that this is something that's changed over time. And another interesting fact is if you look up academic citations for disgust, and I've done this prior to the year 2000, you will find almost nothing. The interest in disgust has just exploded since the year 2000. It's just like a hockey stick looking at that curve. So it may just be that when people started studying this, this was true, right? Disgust was only used in certain contexts by certain groups, but it's no longer true, certainly. Okay, so the third question, and this is the normative philosophical question, right? Should, whatever this role is that moral disgust is playing, should we let it play this role, or should we work to eliminate it from our moral discourse? Okay. And notice, in this and in some of what I'm about to say, you could ask these questions about other emotions as well, right? We could ask this question about guilt, right? So there's a philosopher named Gilbert Harman who says, you should get rid of guilt altogether, right? He claims not to feel guilt. I don't believe him. He seems too nice for that, right? But, some people think we could just do without guilt. We could do without anger, right? So a lot of the questions that come up in this context could be raised about other emotions as well. Typically, people who ask these questions about disgust don't want to get rid of emotion altogether. They think there's something particularly problematic about disgust. Okay. So I'll start with the first question. Like I said, I'm not going to say that much about the second. And then I'll look at some answers to this third. Okay. So there's 5 possible roles for disgust and really for any emotion in moral judgments. One would be as a kind of input, that you feel the emotion and you take it as evidence that a moral wrong has been done. So you think back to the example of guilt, too, right? You do something, you feel guilty as soon as you've done it, and then you think, oh, maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have taken that gum, or whatever the thing is, right? That would be a kind of input to moral judgment. The emotion makes you think you did something wrong. It's your evidence, right? The second would be that disgust could be an output of moral judgment, right? You do look at the situation, you see that it's wrong, and then you feel disgust as a consequence of that, right? You shouldn't have closed that border to aid. I feel disgusted by the wrongness of your action, something like that. A third possibility, and some philosophers have defended this view, disgust just is the judgment that something is wrong, right? If I see someone using racist language and I feel disgusted, that's just to make a judgment that they've done something wrong, right? It just the emotion and the moral judgment are one and the same, right? Now, I should pause and say, I think this is a fairly challenging view to defend, because notice, like, you know, picking your nose and eating it is like pretty gross, but like, you do it in the privacy of your own home. I don't think you're doing anything wrong, right? Like, morally wrong, right? So anyone who wants to defend this third view is going to have to explain why there's lots of stuff that's disgusting but doesn't seem morally wrong. A fourth possibility is that disgust makes an action seem more wrong than it otherwise would. It amplifies moral judgment in a way. And the fifth possibility, which I have defended, and which I think is correct, is that disgust serves as a way of communicating wrongness to others. That the language of disgust, the facial expressions of disgust, it's a way of signaling not just to the person who's committed the wrong, but more importantly maybe to other people standing by that a wrong has been committed, right? And I will just say here that I think moral philosophy often acts as if in any given act there's two people involved. We have this very dyadic picture of moral violations. There's me, the person doing the wrong thing, and there's you, the person on the receiving end of my moral wrong. But I think moral philosophy often leaves out this third, maybe the most important person, the bystander, right? Take a moment to feel pity for the bystander. The bystander sees me wronging you and now must decide, what do I do? Do I get involved? Which side do I get involved on, right? This is a really tough dilemma because if you pick the wrong side, right, you know, the consequences could be serious, right? So we often overlook the importance of moral language and in moral judgment of this third person, right? And I actually think a lot of our moral thought and discourse is really aimed at this third person and helping them out. They're the person who really has this tricky problem, right? You know you've been wronged. I know I've wronged you. This poor third guy doesn't know what to think. So my disgust face, my language of disgust, it tells you you've done something wrong, but maybe even more importantly, it tells this third person, like, oh, a wrong has been done. A wrong has been committed. Right? She's disgusted by what that person did. A norm has been violated, right? That's really important, especially if you're in a novel situation, you don't know what norms are in play, right? You know, this could be a life or death situation, right? So it's really useful to have a very quick, effective way of communicating when a moral violation has taken place. And so this is another role that disgust can play. Okay. Now, I should also say that some people have denied that disgust plays any of these roles. Some people have said, look, you know, we use bodily urges as metaphors all the time. Hungry for knowledge, right? You're not actually going to eat a book. Lust for life, you know, you're not actually, you know, sexually attracted to life. Maybe talking about moral disgust is just like this. You're not actually disgusted. You're just using the language of disgust to communicate something. I think that there is some merit to this criticism, and I think it raises really interesting questions about the epistemology and philosophy of emotions, right? What does it mean to say that something makes you angry? If I say, you know, it makes me really mad when people cut me off on the road, does that mean that every single time someone cuts me off on the road, I have to feel rage? Is it enough if I feel it sometimes? How mad do I have to be, right? Can I just think to myself, that makes me mad? Or do I have to feel like shaking, visceral rage, right? Likewise, if I say, you know, when people buy their way into colleges, it disgusts me. Do I have to actually want to puke, like, for that to be true? Is it enough if I just think, like, yeah, that's disgusting, right? How do we know when, you know, and how do we know when we can attribute an emotion to someone, and when we're attributing it to an entire category of thing, like a moral violation, when do we feel justified in doing that? I'm not going to answer those questions. I do not have an answer for you. But I think they're really tricky questions, and I think that it kind of complicates the metaphor view, and I wonder if it makes it a bit, not beside the point, right? But I think we can still keep asking all these interesting questions about disgust, even if it turns out that it is a metaphor. Okay. So let's look at some experiments having to do with disgust. In one case, when subjects were asked to fill out questionnaires involving moral violations at either a desk covered in like dirty plates and pizza boxes and used tissues, right? Or in a room that had been treated with fart spray before they came in. Subjects filling out the questionnaires in those conditions judge the violations significantly more harshly than subjects filling out their questionnaires in neutral conditions. There's a new study in press that actually kind of does the reverse. It gives subjects ginger, which is supposed to suppress nausea, and claims that you can kind of make this effect go away. So, an earlier study actually used hypnosis to induce subjects to feel disgust at certain words, like often or sometimes, and found that when subjects were given vignettes containing those words, they judged the actions as more severe than subjects who hadn't been hypnotized to feel the disgust. In fact, even in cases where the vignette was like pretty neutral, right? So there's a case of like, Dan, the student council president who often brings interesting speakers to campus. And you got a few subjects who were like, yeah, that's wrong. And you're like, wait, why is it wrong that he does this? And they would kind of confabulate, like, I don't know, this Dan guy, he's just up to something. I don't, there's something going on there, right? So people are taking this feeling of disgust and it's kind of making them, cueing them to some kind of judgment of wrongness, it looks like. Yeah. There's other experiments involving the ultimatum game. I don't know if you're familiar with the ultimatum game. It's kind of what it sounds like. So I would give you $10 as the experimenter. I give you $10 and you've got a partner, right? And you can offer your partner as much or as little of that $10 as you want, and they can take it or leave it. That's all they can do. Now, the rational thing to do might be to just take whatever you're offered as the recipient, right? Because, it's that or nothing. But it's kind of interesting because people will actually reject very low offers, right? Even though it's better than nothing, in fact, to people it's not, right? It's offensive to be offered $1. So people will reject it. And if you analyze people's facial expressions while they're rejecting these really unfair offers, what you see is the classic disgust face. And then if you ask them to report their emotions, people will self-report feeling disgusted by these low offers, right? This again is more evidence that disgust is not just operating in realms of sex, right, and food, but also in realms of fairness. People feel disgusted by unfairness. You see disgust a lot, incidentally, when you look at like sentencing reports in white-collar crime. You see a lot of judges being like, oh, I'm disgusted by your actions, right? Tax evasion cases, stuff like that. There's some neuroimaging studies showing that there's overlap in the brain areas activated when you show people disgusting stuff and when you give them stories that induce moral indignation. And this is sort of grist for my mill. When you ask people to choose faces and language that they would use to communicate their moral concern for others to bystanders, they choose the disgust face often over even like an anger face or something like that. So all of this shows that disgust definitely plays some role in moral judgment. What that role is remains unsettled and is the subject of significant controversy among philosophers and psychologists alike. So we can divide philosophical views on disgust into two camps, which I will call very creatively the disgust advocates and the disgust skeptics. Right? The disgust advocates say, look, disgust is really this wise emotion. It's cueing us into something really important. So we have Leon Cass here, who says, disgust is the emotional expression of deep wisdom beyond reason's power to fully articulate it. We intuit and feel immediately and without argument the violation of things that we rightfully hold dear. Okay? So he's right, disgust is kind of this really intelligent response, right? You see, when you're disgusted by something, it's because you see a really deep moral violation happening, right? Here we have someone named John Keeks who says, that's how you say his name, deep disgust is revulsion at acts that subvert the moral foundation of a society. The subversion consists in the gross violation of moral taboos. The violations threaten that society's conception of civilized life, and he goes so far as to say morally committed people ought to feel disgust at some acts. It's not just okay to express yourself using the word disgust. You should. If you care about morality, you better get disgusted by stuff, right? Deep disgust in particular some moral situations in which feelings, and deep disgust in particular, do and ought to play a dominant role. Right? There are things you should be disgusted by. Now, one interesting question is, what role disgust should play in the law? So there's a philosopher named Dan Hahn who has argued that there are situations in which properly directed disgust is indispensable to a morally accurate perception of what's at stake in the law. So he cites this case where there was a murderer who tortured and mutilated and killed his victim in incredibly horrible ways. I really regret looking this case up earlier today. And he kept souvenirs of his crime. And this took place in Massachusetts. So I guess in Massachusetts, you know, there's some law about getting your property back after the case has been settled. So this person was sentenced to life without parole, in part because the court said, your crimes are so offensive and egregious. And then he asked for his souvenirs to be returned to his representative outside of court. It's like, who's the representative? I don't know. That raises some disturbing questions of its own. But in ruling that that could not happen, that they wouldn't return the souvenirs, the court basically said, it's so offensive to think that you would even want these things, right? That there's no way we would ever give them back. And Kahan says, look, this decision is obviously correct, but there's no basis for this reasoning other than the intuition that the court gives, namely that the request is just disgusting. It's just disgusting to want these things. It disgusts us, right? So this is very much in line with those previous quotes that, you know, there's certain things that as civilized society, we should just be disgusted by, and that that's okay, right? Now, interestingly, we can contrast this with a case in Colorado where the Supreme Court overruled a lower court's decision to allow photos of the murder victim. And they said, these photos serve only to incite the jurors to passion, prejudice, nausea, disgust, revolt, and all of the human emotions that are supposed to be omitted from deliberations. So two very different perspectives, excuse me, sorry, on what role disgust ought to play in our legal deliberations. Right, this has come up also in questions involving anti-abortion protests. Right, you have a right to free speech, but if the images you're showing are really disgusting, is that a basis for ruling them out? Right, so these, you know, disgusting speech, things like this. So you can see too where this is not just an idle philosophical question, right? Not that philosophical questions are ever idle, right? But we have important practical implications too for our view of disgust. Okay, on the other side, and more in line with the Colorado court's ruling, we have the Disgust Skeptics. And this is summed up pretty neatly in this quote from a philosopher named Dan Kelly, who says, the default position to the use of disgust or repugnance, and here he means in moral, judgment, or discourse, should be one not of trust but suspicion. Feelings of disgust should be given no weight in deciding whether an issue is morally acceptable or morally problematic. And Kelly goes on to argue that in fact, if you have feelings of disgust, you should subject that judgment to special scrutiny, because disgust is so misleading that you should be especially wary of moral judgments that involve disgust. So there's three kinds of arguments that the Disgust Skeptic makes for their position, and I'll go through them briefly one by one. I think actually I'm going to start with the second, the content-based arguments, right? This is the idea that disgust just involves such incoherent, obviously false thoughts that like it would be like invoking, you know, a notion of taboo or cursed in your moral justification. It's just not true, right? So here's this quote from Martha Nussbaum that I think really sums up the view. She says, disgust is usually based on magical thinking rather than on real danger. It revolves around a wish to be the type of being that one is not, namely non-animal, I should say immortal. Everybody proofread your work all the time. Non-animal and immortal. Its thoughts about contamination serve the ambition of making ourselves non-human, and this ambition, however ubiquitous, is problematic and irrational, involving self-deception and vain aspiration. And this goes back to that earlier point about tears, right? Why are we not disgusted by tears? Because they're already non-animal, right? It's the difference between tears and other bodily fluids. Now, this kind of view, I think, has its roots in something called terror management theory. Any psychology majors here might have come across this view. This is the idea that basically, as conscious, reflective humans, we are immediately confronted with awareness of our own death, and this is terrifying to us. And much of our civilization and culture is directed at suppressing and denying this fear of death, right? Religion, disgust, this idea that animals die, so if we acknowledge that we are like all other animals, we will be forced to acknowledge our own mortality. So we come up with all of this culture and civilization to distance ourselves from this concept. Now, be that as it may, I feel the first thing I should point out is that comparisons to animals are not universally avoided, right? In many cultures, even in our own, it can be quite complimentary to compare someone to an animal. There are entire religious and spiritual systems based on highlighting our kinship to animals, right? So this idea that we're constantly seeking to distance ourselves from reminders of our animal nature seems to me false. A second point is, look, it's quite possible that disgust could be about these things. But notice, the idea behind this view is this is so essential to the emotion of disgust that it should rule it out, right, altogether. And I just don't see, first of all, this commits you to a view of emotion in general, where to have an emotion is to have a lot of thoughts, right? Like if you look at a picture of someone eating a worm, this is a lot of thought content, right, to have when you're like, ew. So I'm a little skeptical that this is so essential to the experience of disgust that we can say that, every occurrence of disgust involves having these kinds of mistaken thoughts. So for that reason, I do not think this is a good argument for eliminating disgust from our moral discourse. I'm going to move on to what I think is a more promising argument, and this is a kind of historical argument, namely that, look, disgust has been put to some really bad uses in the past. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. The rhetoric of disgust has been used to justify and motivate absolutely morally reprehensible things, and still is, right? It's been used to dehumanize groups and individuals. It's been used to justify exclusion, discrimination, even genocide, certainly systematic oppression, right? You see it over and over again. And I think that is something that makes a lot of people wary about defending disgust in any way. I know that it is certainly given me pause in the past. And I think it would be remiss to defend disgust and not acknowledge this fact about it. Having said that, we can also see disgust having positive uses, right? Disgust can be used to bring about social change. There's a recent book by Anthony Appiah, a philosopher at NYU who writes the ethicist column in the New York Times, where he argued for a role for shame in bringing about moral change, that you can basically change cultural practices by shaming people who continue to participate in them. And I think that you can see a similar role for disgust. Certainly public health campaigns often invoke disgust. In my food and philosophy class, we're talking about campaigns to encourage healthy eating, and there's, I don't know if anyone's from New York City, there was one that used to run on the New York City subways, and it was like, if you drink soda, you're pouring on the pounds, but it was like fat coming out of the, I thought about putting a picture in, but I was like, yeah, it's pretty gross, I'm telling you, like fat coming out of the soda bottles, you know what I'm talking about, into the glass. It was intense, right? But, smoking, right? Think about the warnings on cigarette packs, and in other countries, they're really intense, right? And I can tell you, they work. So we can put disgust to positive uses too, and I think, the historical usage to which it's been put is certainly problematic, but it's also unclear whether that's due to something essential to the emotion itself or whether that's a kind of historical contingency. So the third kind of argument I'm going to use, or I'm going to look at, has to do with evolution. And this is the idea that disgust, as we said at the beginning of this talk, evolved for a certain purpose. It evolved to track poisons, pathogens, and parasites. And it's only later that humans start to co-opt it, right, to take it out of its original context, to regulate social interactions, social norms, and kind of ethnic boundaries, right? Now, this has led some people to say, look, yeah, maybe disgust can be effective in other contexts, but it can also be completely ineffective or outright irrational, right? And the idea is that, because you're taking disgust out of the context it was designed for, of course it's not going to work very well, right? It was never designed to do this job, right? So it shouldn't surprise us that it misfires all the time in social and moral contexts, and it's not very good in those contexts. Now, I think that this is an interesting argument. I think it's been very appealing to people because it seems to have the most empirical support, right? There's a really plausible evolutionary story where this is the original rule for disgust. I think, one question is whether this kind of argument tends to overgeneralize. So there are lots of things that didn't evolve maybe for the purpose that we now use them for, but that still seem well suited for that purpose. There's a really interesting book by psychologists Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber where they talk about, they think like our ability to reason actually just evolved to win arguments. Like it had nothing to do with finding the truth or like certainly not being good at philosophy, right? It was just about like convincing people to do what you wanted them to do, right? That's why we evolved that capacity. Now, does that show that like we should just give up on logic and all stop taking philosophy classes? No, let me be very clear, it does not show that, okay? So you might worry that this style of argument, if we grant it, would overgeneralize and would show too much. But I think that there's another response to this argument, and this is one that I've made elsewhere, which is that actually there is an analog of contamination in the social and moral domain, namely that behaviors and attitudes are contagious, right? They spread through social networks. So if you think of Disgust's original role as policing contagion in the physical domain, it's just false to say that there's no analog of that role in the social and moral domain, right? The research on social contagion is really interesting, and it actually comes out of like public health. And I think originally like this the Framingham heart study, anyone familiar with this? Taken a public health class maybe? They just amassed all of this data, and it was a really long-term study. They're following people's heart health really over decades, and they would say, we want to follow up with you, so let us know. We will know how to get in touch with you if we can't find you. And as a result, they ended up with all of this data on people's social networks and relationships. Of course, now we have Facebook, so we don't really need to do this, right? But one thing you see is that behaviors like smoking, quitting smoking, binge drinking, divorce, weight gain, all of these things spread through social networks, right? We also know from the literature on social norms that what we do is heavily influenced by what others do, right? A sign that says no littering might make you not litter, but seeing someone litter is going to completely override the effect of that sign. Even seeing litter on the ground, right, tells you other people are littering, I guess I'll litter too, right? Even if you really don't care, you don't have any motivation to litter, right? So I think the other reason that byproduct arguments fail is that these arguments rest on the assumption that like the role disgust plays in the moral domain and the role it plays in the physical domain are totally different. And I just don't think empirically that that's true. So I think these also fail. Okay. So where does this leave us? And almost done here, I'll wrap up in a minute. I think what we can see so far is that disgust does play a role in moral judgment. The Disgust Skeptic says it shouldn't, but I don't think any of their arguments are persuasive. However, having said that, I find myself sympathetic to the view, right? When I think back to those quotes at the beginning of the talk, I think there's a better way to express this, right? A way that doesn't involve the language of disgust. Disgust does seem to have a poor historical track record. And it seems that when we say that we're disgusted by someone's behavior, there's something about that language that seems kind of a little just icky. I don't know. So when we think about how to explain this intuition, I want to offer an alternative to the skeptical arguments we've seen so far. And it involves moral disagreement. So allow me to digress just a moment. I think disagreement gets a bad rap. It's one of the other topics I work on. I'm teaching a seminar on it right now. I think disagreement is great. And you know who agrees with me? John Stuart Mill. He says, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, but if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion." Nor is it enough that he should hear the arguments of adversaries from his own teachers. That is not the way to do justice to the arguments or bring them into real contact with his own mind. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them, who defend them in earnest and do their very utmost for them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. He must feel the whole force of the difficulty which the true view of the subject has to encounter and dispose of. So notice what Mill is saying here. To really know your view, you have to engage with your opponent. You have to engage in disagreement. And it's not enough to take a class where your teacher tells you, oh, and here are the arguments against this thing. You have to actually go out into the wild and find the person who really disagrees with you, who's really convinced. And you have to engage with their arguments. And that's when you actually know, Mill says. That's when you actually know your view. Even if your view is true, until you've subjected it to this test, subjected it to disagreement, you don't really know it. Right? This is how you actually, elsewhere he says, this is the only way a man can get wisdom. So that's the good side of disagreement. It's a kind of epistemic workout, right? It tests the justification of our views. It forces us to put them under scrutiny. We end up defending them. We learn more about them, right? Where our conviction is strengthened, we're in a better position after the disagreement than we were beforehand. Okay. However, there's the bad too. And I think we see a lot of this as well, right? This language of tribal politics, polarization, right, leads to political division, mistrust, violence. There's studies showing that the more polarized political language becomes, the more, and this is across all countries, people tend to support authoritarian and totalitarian policies. I think this is a really interesting statistic. So in 1958, Gallup did a poll, and they asked Americans, would you care if your child married someone of the opposite political party? And 72% of people were like, no, I would not care at all. So in 2016, a researcher repeated this poll, and the number had dropped to 45% who said they wouldn't care. And if you ask people who strongly identify themselves with a party, that number drops even further. That's really striking, right? You would be upset if your child married someone from a different political party. Here you see the number of people who find talking politics stressful has increased significantly. That's just between 2016 and 2018, right? And the numbers are not very clear, but that jumped over 12%, right, in 2 years, the number of people who find talking politics with the other side stressful. Now, if you find something stressful, if you're like me, you're probably not going to do it very much, right? You're going to avoid it when you can. But this is really bad, because guess what? If you only talk to people who agree with you, guess what this does to your views? It makes them even stronger and more polarized. And guess what that does in turn to your willingness to talk to people who disagree with you? It reduces it. And guess what that does? It entrenches your views. So this is a self-perpetuating cycle, right? Where you end up not wanting to talk to those who disagree with you. You get further entrenched in your views. And if Mill is right, this also, undermines our own justification and knowledge of our views, right? So this is really bad. Okay, what does this have to do with disgust? Well, I think that the reason for being skeptical of disgust doesn't have to do with its historical track record, it doesn't have to do with some essential magicality in its content, and it doesn't have to do with its evolutionary past. I think instead, the problem with disgust has to do with moral disagreement. Now notice the types of issues in which disgust tends to be invoked tend to be highly controversial. I didn't really talk about GMOs, but that's an interesting case where we see a lot of disgust rhetoric, and it is clearly aligned on the liberal side of the spectrum, I think. It turns out that the best predictor of whether someone will agree with the statement, GMOs should not be pursued regardless of the risks or benefits, is whether they are disgusted by the idea of GMOs, right? So it predicts really strong opposition. You see this also, I think disgust plays a big role in our attitudes towards things like lab-grown meat, which I predict will be in markets soon. And if you don't know what that is, we can talk about that in the Q&A too. So remember what I said before, that I think one way disgust functions is to communicate moral disapproval, not just to the person and thing it's directed at, but to bystanders, right? So when we invoke the language of disgust, we're signaling a kind of rejection to both the person it's directed at and to those watching, right? You know, notice when you tweet at someone like, that language disgusts me, are you really saying it so that person will hear it, or are you saying that so your 10,000 followers will know, oh, you're disgusted by that thing? I'm not on Twitter, but even I know it's the second thing. Okay, I'm gonna skip this, I think. Now, remember again some of the key features of disgust behavioral profile, right? It motivates distancing and withdrawal, not just from the disgusting thing, but from anything allied with that thing, right? It portrays its elicitor as offensive and contaminating, right? And this is a very quick and automatic response. We often experience it as something we don't fully have control over. And another thing about disgust we haven't really touched on is it's very resistant to new information, right? So if I dip a cockroach in your orange juice and you're disgusted by cockroaches, you're not going to want that juice, right? If I tell you, oh, don't worry, that was a sterilized cockroach, I'm going to guess you still won't want the juice, right? If you give, yeah. So this is exactly the opposite of the kind of behavior that leads to constructive disagreement, right? Namely, the kind of engaging with, seeking to understand the reasons of your opponent. This is not, the kind of disagreement we're going to get when disgust is in play. So if this is right, then disgust and moral disagreement is a recipe for polarization and conflict. And that, I want to claim, is what is wrong with moral disgust. So thank you. Suggestion would be, for cases of moral disagreement, that we should try not to let ourselves be swayed too much by the use of disgust language as bystanders. So when we see the disgust language, one thing is to be, I think it helps to be aware, right, that disgust is going to trigger a certain response in us, right, so that we can be on guard, for this kind of immediate rejection, right, of the object of disgust. As participants in a disagreement, I think this can let us know that maybe disgust is not a constructive way to express disagreement, and that we could try to avoid using disgust language to signal our rejection of an idea when we're engaged on particularly controversial topics and when we're engaged in particularly public settings and ways, right? Is that your question?
So would that make us morally right in that scenario?
Well, that might, so I guess another point to make is, I don't think that using disgust language makes you morally wrong, right? It might depend, notice in a lot of these cases, people were expressing what I would consider morally laudable views, right? But they were doing it using rhetoric that I think is particularly unhelpful. So it could be, you could certainly express morally reprehensible views using disgust too. So I think that disgust itself is morally neutral, but unhelpful, if that makes sense.
So kind of actually tied to that, would you say then that the reason maybe that since 2000 this has kind of shot up in the news and everything like that is that people are just getting really lazy? And it's a lazy way to argue because you feel like I'm disgusted by that because you can then just stop the conversation, it's like you don't have to give further reasons necessarily. It's just like, no, like it's disgusting, like that's the end. And it's very like emotional, but yet try to come off very genuine. But I would almost say that in all those examples at the beginning, it almost seems kind of disingenuous. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, I think that's really interesting. I do think that that explains the rise we see in like public disgust rhetoric.
Yeah, I think more in the political realm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think it's a way to signal, I think, it's partly a way to signal to others like, oh, I would never even be associated with this thing, right? Notice we really, I think, have a tendency to demand that people distance themselves from things. I don't know if this is, it seems kind of new to me, but I don't know if it's as new as it seems. my students in my disagreement seminar was talking about cancel culture the other day. This idea that you just, I don't really know what this is, but it seems like it's a related idea where you just kind of like, reject something and reject things associated with it. I don't know. I probably shouldn't talk about it since I just said I don't know what it is, so that would probably be a sign to maybe just not talk about it.
We had some events like that.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting. Does that answer your question? No, I mean, so the other answer is I actually think that the rise in scholarly interest since 2001 can be traced to like one paper, which is kind of a shocking claim. But like Jonathan Haidt did this paper, he's a psychologist, and he basically asked people for their intuitions about moral scenarios that were harmless but involved disgust, like buying a chicken at, I don't know if I should say this one, buying a chicken at the grocery store, having sex with it, and then cooking it and eating it, right? And people were like, yeah, that's really wrong. But it's kind of hard to say what's wrong with it, and like, given a lot of what goes on in factory farming, arguably the wrong part was buying the chicken in the grocery store in the first place, right? Everything you did after that was kind of, anyway. So this paper came out, and he was basically saying, look, these intuitions can only be explained by disgust. They can't be explained by pointing to any kind of harm or anything like that. And that paper just garnered a huge amount of interest. And this is speculation, but I really think like that paper just put disgust on the map, and then everyone was kind of responding to it. And it's a relatively easy thing to study experimentally too. Like, you can buy fart spray pretty cheap on Amazon. If you decide to try this, I will warn you to be very careful with it, because my friend and I almost shut down the Michigan psychology department trying to do one of, I was helping her with one of these experiments. But so I think part of it is just the ease of studying in a way. I don't know. This is speculation though.
I have a question. So how do you know to discuss when it comes to politics and what Trump did? Where to draw a line from like discussing and actually listening to what the person is saying, even though the things that they're saying are like not appealing to you at all.
Right.
They're saying.
Right. So I think this is really interesting. There's I think that disgust is a way of not listening to what someone is saying. I don't think we're, the question of whether we're necessarily obligated to listen to everything that everyone says is kind of a separate question, right? But I think one question is how we go about rejecting something, or on what basis we decide not to listen to it. And I think that the language of disgust is not the best way to express our rejection. I mean, first of all, it's fairly not descriptive. So if you voice your opposition in terms of disgust, you haven't really identified, what it is about that language or that rhetoric that's, that you're rejecting. I think that there is, a lot of people use the language of disgust on both sides of political debate now. And I think that we would be better served by pointing to the particular things we are rejecting rather than this kind of global rejection of disgust. Does that answer your question, though? Kind of. There's this idea also of sometimes referred to as like decoupling when it comes to disagreements, and this is the idea that to have a constructive disagreement, you should try to focus on like the actual issue you're disagreeing about and take away as many of the associated claims as you can, right? So, one thought here might be, look, if you disagree with a policy, you may be disgusted by Trump, right? But try to decouple that from your issue with the policy and try to focus on just explaining the policy, because that's more likely to lead to a productive disagreement where the other side is better able to understand you and you're better able to understand the other side. Now notice, if you are someone who disagrees with Trump and you're trying to express that disagreement to a Trump supporter, if you say, oh, I'm just disgusted by the whole thing, right, that disagreement is unlikely to be productive in the sense Bill is describing, where they're going to tell you now their reasons and you're going to better articulate your reasons. It's kind of a conversation stopper, right, to say disgust. But if you can, point to the more specifics of what it is you disagree with, you're more likely to have a productive disagreement.
If I can jump in quickly. So I want to try and make a case for disgust, not necessarily, moral disgust, not necessarily being dismissive or the hindering of meaningful disagreement. And so, if we say a snake is disgusting, we see the slithering as being disgusting, and then we say, therefore, that snake is disgusting.
Okay.
But I don't want to say that we can't say that of a person. We can say that pus is disgusting, and therefore that person who's pussy is disgusting. think when we go to moral judgments and applying disgust to it, we're right to say the actions of a pedophile are disgusting. But we might be wrong to make the jump to say that that individual is disgusting. So I think the moral jump to evaluating things with disgust doesn't have something, be necessarily the avoidance factor, right? Like, you're justified in avoiding that behavior, but not necessarily that person in and of themselves.
Right.
And so what's divisive is us applying disgust to moral judgments in the way that we apply it to non-moral judgments. Properly understood, it doesn't have to be divisive.
Right. So that's, yeah, so it's sort of like be disgusted at the sin, not the sinner.
I was reluctant to say that.
Yeah, so I think there's two things I can say here, and which one I say depends on whether or not I want to contradict my earlier self. So one thing to say is, look, yeah, we can definitely direct disgust at a behavior and not at a person, and that, you know, one thing I like about the kind of account I'm giving here is that it doesn't, unlike the other skeptical accounts, it doesn't rule out disgust altogether. It tells us that we should be very careful where and when we deploy disgust. And one way to describe what I'm trying to do with this very new kind of line of thought is to kind of diagnose our intuition that there's something troubling about disgust. And to say, look, maybe we have this intuition, but maybe we don't have to get rid of disgust altogether. We just have to be very careful where and how we use it. The other thing I could say, if I wanted to contradict my earlier self of like 2018, would be, you know, well, you could try to do that, but the thing about disgust is it globalizes so quickly that, like, you're not really ever just going to be like, oh, snake, I would have no problem with you if you were less slithery. You're just going to be like, ew, snake. Or you're going to be like, oh, it's really your pus that bothers me, not you. Like, you're always just going to be like, get that guy away from me, or something like that. But I'll just say the first thing, and, you know, acknowledge that someone else might say the second thing.
Yeah, interesting, great.
So we talk a lot about America and such. I'm not quite sure if you looked into this or not, but in other like political societies, is disgust used the way we use it? Maybe obviously there's probably not a word for it, but is there some sort of like thing that goes along with it in other countries?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I honestly don't know the answer. This is, you know, something I really just, the first part of the talk is stuff I've thought about for a long time. Stuff on disagreement is something I'm just starting to think about, but that's a great suggestion, so thank you. That would be really interesting to look at.
So, recognizing that disgust isn't an effective way of arguing against somebody who disagrees with you, but have you seen through your research whether or not using the rhetoric of disgust has been effective at getting a bystander or third party in one way or another towards a specific topic or person?
That's another great question. I have not seen that. Anecdotally, it seems to me that it is. It seems like a really good way to marshal kind of like outrage or rejection in media or on social media. But I can't, you know, I don't have any research I can point to back that up. But that is a really great point. Yeah. I don't know what you think. My thought would be like, yeah, it is, right? It's a very galvanizing emotion. But like I said, that would be something really interesting to look at too.
Other thoughts, comments, questions, any disgusting anecdotes?
I am planning to eat after this, so maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that's first. Okay, well, thank you very much. Enjoy